Would you journey to the heart of darkness, to places that are shrines to evil, to discover how Adolf Hitler was disposed of by the KGB?
Hitler was literally ground to dust.
Who took a serial killer's tombstone for a souvenir?
He's attracted a kind of cult following.
Where's the grave of Jesse James? Here, here, or even here?
Everybody wants to claim that they were Jesse James.
And where's the head of the man who killed the King of England?
They exacted revenge even upon his corpse.
Amazing true stories. Were these people too wicked to ever rest in peace? The grave. The reign of the cruelest tyrant, the most heartless serial killer, all have to end sometime. But though they end in death, sometimes the legacy of evil lives on. His name was Ed Gein, and he brought horror to small-town America.
He is that cannibal ogre that has been haunting your imagination since childhood, and there he really was.
Ed Gein was a farmer's son. But after his brother, his father, and his mother died, he lived alone at this old farmhouse outside of Plainfield, Wisconsin. A town of just 500 people. An ordinary kind of town. But what was about to unfold here would shock the entire world, would spawn the most terrifying movies ever made.
What happened was true.
So how did Ed Gein become Plainfield's most famous, no, most infamous son? What triggered an explosion of evil within? Plainfield's hardware store hasn't changed much in 50 years. Since the day in 1957 when its owner, Bernice Warden, suddenly went missing. Mrs. Warden's folks called out the county sheriff. But crime in Plainfield? Things like that just didn't happen. For the officer sent to visit the Gein farmhouse, why, it was just a routine call. Ed was a frequent customer at the store. Maybe he'd seen something. How could anyone have suspected the horror which was about to unfold?
Gein wasn't home at the time, so the police broke in, and that's where they made this horrific discovery.
In the flashlight glare, Bernice Warden's corpse dangling from a meat hook.
She'd been gutted. She'd been decapitated. Her head was hung up on the wall, like some kind of ornament.
They were inside the lair of a monster. Under piles of garbage, body parts from more than a dozen corpses.
The police found soup bowls that Gein apparently used for that purpose, which were made out of the tops of human skulls. They found chairs that were upholstered in human flesh.
Some of Gein's collection came from his own fresh kills. The rest he'd plundered from Plainfield Cemetery. But what had turned the farmhand into a murderer, a ghoul? Would their search provide an answer, or just fresh horror? Whose room was this? Preserved, frozen in time. Then the pieces began to fall into place.
Ed Gein's mother died in 1945. He was a mama's boy to the nth degree, and shortly after her death, he made some effort to dig up her corpse and bring it back to the farmhouse because he missed her so desperately.
The bodies Gein stole were all women. He needed them to be fresh to carry out his most astonishing act of evil.
He had skinned several women and made a vest and leggings that he would dress himself in, pretending apparently to be his own mother. Gein was a transvestite of particularly unspeakable stripe because he wasn't just wearing the clothes of women, he was actually dressing himself in the skins of women.
Ed Gein became a byword for evil, but he also became a star. The car he'd used to carry corpses was displayed at county fairs. But when a businessman tried to buy the Gein House of Horrors, Plainfield folk burned it down. All that's there today is this stand of trees. In Wacoma, just along from Plainfield, there's the jail cell where Ed Gein was held for questioning. It's now a museum. And Plainfield Cemetery? Well, it's there that Ed Gein himself became a victim of modern-day grave robbers. Declared insane, confined to a mental institution, Ed Gein died in 1984, age 78. He was buried in the same ground which he'd once prowled as a grave robber. Close to his victims, but between his beloved mother, father, and brother. But Ed Gein would not rest in peace. The ultimate souvenir of a visit to Plainfield? The killer's tombstone. The county sheriffs opened a new Ed Gein file. This time, the killer was the victim. But the stone didn't remain at large for long. The thieves weren't all that smart.
Where the stone is right now is our large evidence and record storage. This always remains locked.
A group of Gein fans from Seattle had taken the tombstone, then tried to sell souvenir rubbings over the internet.
This is the way we got it from Seattle. You notice a lot of chipping done to it. That was one of the things we noticed right away. The original had a lot of chips on it and also the carving on the inside of the stone itself over the years. So we knew it wasn't a copy, it was the original stone.
So who wants this token of evil? The museum?
We would not accept it because we're afraid of theft. Some people said it's history and that it should be here. My own personal opinion is it should be back in the cemetery where it belongs. But then, of course, you have the same problem of danger of it being stolen again.
And so there it will remain, under lock and key, hidden away. But this murderous madman will never be forgotten.
Ed Gein is the prototype of all of the axe and knife and chainsaw wielding psychos who have populated the cinema since the 1960s.
Alfred Hitchcock's greatest shocker.
In Psycho, mother-fixated Ed Gein became murderous Norman Bates. The makers of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre learned from Ed Gein too.
And you see the Gein influence there, very, very clearly in the figure of Leatherface, who wears a mask fashioned out of human skin. Ed Gein has always attracted a kind of cult following. There are people who wear Ed Gein t-shirts, and there's an Ed Gein fan club.
Why would anyone become a fan of a grave robber?
The disjunction between this Forrest Gump character, this kind of half-witted village idiot type, and then somebody who in the darkness of his little farmhouse was engaging in the most unspeakable acts that the human mind can conceive, and even acts that most of us can't even conceive, that makes him just tremendously fascinating to people.
Maybe those fans have done us a service after all. Because of them, the only memorial to Ed Gein is a hole in the dirt. A grave for a grave robber. How does our fascination with evil turn villains into heroes? Ensure that their burial sites are as eagerly sought out as those of film stars, kings, and queens. Why are the gangsters and gunslingers of earlier times now remembered not as brutal murderers, but as larger-than-life characters with legends that live on? Characters like Al Capone in Mount Carmel Cemetery, Cook County, Illinois. In the grand surroundings of the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in California, another notorious gangster boss, Bugsy Siegel. He was blasted into oblivion in 1947. But it's plain to see, someone still loves Bugsy. And what of this desperado from an earlier age, credited with at least 4 murders? Baby-faced William Bonney, Billy the Kid. At just 21, Billy was America's most wanted. He was finally gunned down by Pat Garrett in July 1881 and found his last resting place in the cemetery at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. There, the story should have ended. But the outlaw became a victim of crime himself. In 1950, Billy the Kid's gravestone was stolen. It remained at large for 26 years before turning up in Granbury, Texas. Who took it and why remains a mystery to this day. The tombstone was returned to stand sentinel over the outlaw's grave, but 5 years later, robbers struck a second time. This time, America's most wanted tombstone showed up a week later in Huntington Beach, California. The Fort Sumner sheriff flew in to take the tombstone back into custody. Today, it's back in place in New Mexico. And now, like any desperado, it's chained and caged to make sure it stays put. Why steal from the graves of long-dead killers and outlaws? Is it to feel close to evil? Would it be possible To go still further and steal a killer's identity? Why should one evil deed above all have become the greatest mystery of modern times, attracting outlandish claims, barely believable theories, providing a puzzle which still can perplex us today? Was there ever a crime which left more loose ends, more unanswered questions, than the assassination of President John F. Kennedy by a man we know as Lee Harvey Oswald? Some believe the truth could be discovered here, where the killer is buried. But inside the grave, some investigators found just more questions. Ever since that fateful day in Dallas, the story of the shooting has grown more complex. Was the assassin acting alone? Was he working for a foreign power? What happened in the next few moments would fuel bizarre conspiracy theories for the next 4 decades. Dealey Plaza, still overlooked by the red brick building, believed to be the assassin's vantage point. It's here that the fatal shots struck the president, though who fired them has always been disputed. A short distance away, the scene of a second shooting. It was in this tunnel that the man arrested for the killing was silenced forever.
As he walks through the basement corridor under heavy guard, he too meets sudden, senseless death.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
The same scene repeated in slow motion, then frozen. Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby firing one fatal shot into Oswald's abdomen. Ruby's presence here is inexplicable. The dying Oswald is rushed to the same hospital where President Kennedy's life ebbed away. There will be no trial for Oswald, but federal, state, and city law enforcers promise full and conclusive investigations into Dallas's reign of murder.
Paul Grudy has good cause to remember that day. He's the mortician who signed the killer's death certificate, buried him, and who billed the family for exactly $710. He now claims he has proof that the assassin wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald at all.
Who was this man then? I don't know, and like I've always said, I don't care. None of my business. I only buried the guy.
The autopsy procedure included a craniotomy, removal of the top of the skull, which was carefully replaced by the mortician. The funeral took place on November 25th, 1963. In no time at all, doubts arose about the killer's true identity. Was this indeed ex-U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, or perhaps a look-alike, an expert marksman, Russian maybe, or Cuban, part of a sinister international conspiracy? In 1981, permission was finally granted to exhume the corpse, trying to satisfy the growing number of conspiracy theorists.
You would compare the dental records of the person in the grave with the dental records of the person ante-mortem, in other words, while they were still living, and there were plenty of those available through the Marine Corps because he had been in the Marine Corps, and they keep meticulous records.
Paul Grudy arranged the exhumation. Immediately, he believed something was wrong.
When we disinterred that body in '81, that vault was broken. The casket was broken.
There's no earthquakes, of course, in Texas that would have caused a crack in this 2,700-pound steel-reinforced concrete vault, yet it had been compromised.
For Paul Grudy, surprise quickly turned to suspicion.
The head of that body, when I disinterred him, did not have a craniotomy.
Photos of the decomposed head show this faint line which, in an official report, is said to be evidence of a craniotomy. But Paul Grudy disagrees.
That head that was now on that body was not the head that I embalmed. I know that the body had not been changed because I recognized various things about the body that I had done.
But what did the pathologist report?
We independently and as a team have concluded beyond any doubt, and I mean beyond any doubt, that the individual buried under the name of Lee Harvey Oswald in Rose Hill Cemetery is, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald.
The official verdict. The teeth matched. This was Lee Harvey Oswald. Where does the truth lie? Is the mortician's account just one more outlandish conspiracy theory? If he's correct, when could the head have been switched? Before the burial in 1963?
They wouldn't let anybody into the cemetery except uniformed officers, and there was one behind every tombstone as far as we could tell.
Could a conspirator have been disguised as one of those officials?
No, sir. No possible way that could have been done because all the security was around it and there was no way that anybody could carry a head in a sack or anything and do a head change at that time.
Was this a conspirator claiming Oswald's identity? Was that why he was silenced? Was the real Oswald murdered? The coffin opened, his head placed inside it to fool investigators. Incredible, maybe, but that's what some believe.
When you're willing to blow the brains of the President of the United States out in broad daylight, when you're able to do that in front of over 100 witnesses, have it captured on several films, over 100 photographs taken of it, blame it on one man for 38 years and get away with it, you can get away with anything.
But I still think that it was not necessarily Lee Harvey Oswald. It was a marksman, a man who could shoot that rifle in a proper manner. But I don't know any more than y'all know. I only buried the man that was supposed to have been the man that killed the president.
Will the puzzle be solved anytime soon? Maybe yes, maybe no. Either way, the legend of this man will live on, whoever he is. Just occasionally, the evil dead receive their just desserts. That's how the most evil man in history came to be buried under this puddle. In war graves the world over, row upon row they lie, reminding us of men and women who made the greatest sacrifice, fighting to rid the world of a man far too wicked to be granted a grave, a tombstone of his own. So what did happen to the last remains of Nazi Führer Adolf Hitler? By 1945, the net was closing around Nazi Germany. The Third Reich, which Hitler said would endure 1,000 years, would last a few more days.
People who visited Hitler at this time found him desperately changed. He was a physical wreck, a nervous wreck. He gravitated all the time between moments of complete euphoria, moments of complete despair, hoping that every last straw he grabbed at would keep the Red Army at bay, until the point came when he just began to realize that there was nothing to to be done, and prepared himself for his suicide.
But could there be something even worse than death? What was the terrible fear which haunted the tyrant's last few days? A dispatch had been delivered to Hitler's Berlin bunker. He'd underlined in blue pencil the news of the death of his partner in crime, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The fate of the Italian leader now provided a terrifying warning of what lay ahead.
Mussolini and his mistress had been caught by partisans and had been strung up in a square in Milan, their bodies beaten and abused, and Hitler said he didn't want anything like that to happen. He never wanted to be caught and humiliated in that way.
What might the Russians do with the body of the most hated man in the world? The truth would be stranger than even he could have imagined. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler chewed on a capsule of cyanide. Within a few seconds, he was dead. It's still uncertain whether in those dying moments, Hitler also shot himself, or whether an aide had been ordered to finish the job, to suggest that the Führer died a soldier's death after all. Hitler had left strict instructions on what should happen next. But with the Russians rapidly approaching, there was no time to lose.
Hitler was keen that his body be burnt beyond recognition, so that there would be nothing left for the victorious enemy to gloat about.
The tyrant's final command was obeyed. His charred bones were buried in a shell crater close to the bunker. Hitler's plot had worked even better than he hoped. With no trace of his body, rumors flew around the world. Victorious Russian leader Joseph Stalin felt cheated.
Stalin just was an extraordinarily suspicious character, paranoid about these sorts of things, and convinced that Hitler was a clever enough dictator to wriggle out of the net when it was closing around him.
Stalin ordered a search of the area close to Hitler's bunker, and a Russian soldier made an astonishing discovery. Human remains, including fragments of a jawbone, part of a skull, showing clear signs of a bullet wound. Hitler's dentist was interrogated. His sketch of the Führer's dental chart was all the evidence they needed. But Stalin ordered proof of Hitler's death be kept top secret. This was knowledge he might trade at some later date. But there was some unfinished business. The jaw and skull fragments were safe in Moscow. But what of the other remains found in the shell hole? The KGB were ordered to bury them once again, in secret. They dug beside German KGB headquarters at 36 Westenderstrasse, Magdeburg. For 25 years, the man who dreamed of world domination lay buried in what is now this parking lot. But such an icon of evil was considered too dangerous to remain in one spot.
What would happen if anybody ever found out that the Führer's body was there? Would he become a shrine? Would people try and resuscitate the Third Reich?
Though the skull and jaw fragments were carefully preserved in Moscow, in 1970, an order was issued to dig up the box that had contained the rest of Hitler's remains.
They took it away, cremated it, in the hope that nobody would ever be able to build some sort of shrine to his memory.
The Russians had finally reduced Hitler's body to ashes. just as he'd ordered. So was this the tyrant's last triumph? Well, yes and no. In a final act of revenge, the KGB decided the best way to dispose of those ashes would be to pour them into the sewers of Magdeburg, to erase his physical remains, if not his evil legacy.
Hitler was literally, in the end, ground to dust.
He couldn't escape justice in the end. This man, deemed too wicked to deserve a grave. Yet history, as we've seen, can weave remarkable magic. Once notorious killers become the stuff of legend, descendants fight to claim kinship. The West doesn't seem so wild today. Time was when these parts rang out to the sounds of gunplay, the pounding hooves of an outlaw gang, a posse close behind. Most times, who were the posse chasing? Why, the answer's easy. Jesse James. Though his name is straight out of cowboy legend, Jesse James was real enough. He was raised here in Kearney, Missouri. Visit the James Ranch today, and you feel that maybe Jesse could walk back through the door at any moment. Jesse's folks were small-time farmers, slave owners, like most of their neighbors. It was fighting for the Confederates which gave Jesse his first smell of gunpowder. Maybe a taste for killing, too. What would he do when the war ended? Trade his weapons for farm tools? Not Jesse. Instead, he declared war on law and order. Jesse and his gang, including his brother Frank, robbed banks and raided trains from Texas to Minnesota. Jesse killed more than 20 men along the way. By 1880, he was America's most wanted. A fortune awaited anyone who could bring in Jesse James, dead or alive. But Jesse's gang had seen those posters too. The story goes that one of them, little Bob Ford, began to think about all that money.
Jesse died on April 3rd, 1882 in St. Joseph. He was at his home, and he had a few of the gang members there with him. Bob and Charlie Ford were there, and Jesse had stopped to straighten a picture and was dusting it off. And Bob Ford took advantage of the situation and shot him dead.
But is that how it really happened?
It was not Jesse James. They had a double that they used instead. And Jesse very quietly slipped away, and nobody knew the difference.
Can someone really be trying to rewrite the greatest American outlaw legend? Did Jesse James really live to the ripe old age of 103?
To me, there's never been any doubt. My grandfather was there when he was killed. My grandfather saw him buried. My grandfather moved the body from the James farm down to the local cemetery there in Kearney, Missouri. And it's been no problem. But then people start coming up with these fantastic stories.
Let's examine the evidence. The James family say Jesse was first buried here, right in the farmyard, under the watchful eye of his mother, Zelda.
His mother wanted to keep an eye on his grave and on his body. She feared grave robbers, which was a legitimate fear back then. She feared that someone would come out and remove Jesse's body and possibly take it away.
But wasn't it a little unusual to bury Jesse in a yard rather than in holy ground?
I think it was done purposely because the ones who planned it and carried it off made sure that he was buried in a safe place where no one could open his grave and try to prove that it was someone other than Jesse.
If it wasn't Jesse who died that day, but a look-alike, where did the real Jesse wind up? Here, some people say, in the little town of Granbury, Texas. Remarkably, they claim, he survived till 1951.
On his feet were some black scars that supposedly where he'd been tortured while he was in the Civil War, and the tip of one index finger was missing, and that was another proof that it was the real person.
Here at Granbury Cemetery, the old man's simple wooden grave marker was later replaced by a fine stone monument, which aims a blow at the Missouri claimants. Even on his death certificate, the name's there in black and white. Isn't that some kind of proof?
Doggone it. They tell wild stories and what he did afterwards. He went off and fought in all these wars and all this time. And it's just ridiculous.
We know how they'd have settled this in the old days. But both sides turned to science, to the miracle of DNA. The grave of the Missouri Jesse had already been disturbed, though the obelisk still marks the original spot. In 1902, the remains were taken from the farmyard and buried in the town of Kearney itself, beside Jesse's widow, Zerelda. In 1995, armed with DNA samples from surviving relatives, that's where they started to dig, to settle this once and for all. Right away, an amazing discovery.
The bones were upside down. Jesse was laying face down instead of face up. The bones were so deteriorated in such in horrible shape that they weren't able to extract DNA from them. But there was 12 teeth found in the grave, and they were used for the DNA.
And they exhumed the body and did all kinds of things and came out with a 99.7%. Now, it's a long ways beyond reasonable scientific certainty.
It was a definite maybe.
Supporters of the Texas Jesse weren't going to be beat. They secured a court order to exhume their 103-year-old claimant. In 1999, with DNA samples from another branch of the James family, they began digging in Granbury. Right away, an even more amazing discovery.
They found inside a man with only one arm.
Whoever this was, he certainly had two arms.
We dug where the marker had been set, and it was wrong. They thought they could detect another casket slightly to the left of the one they dug up, but they could not legally open the other grave at that time, so they filled it back in. Of course it was embarrassing, and it was sort of like we made fools of ourselves, but it was so innocently done that we hoped the world would excuse us and let us try again.
And that's what they want to do. To dig a second time. To prove that Jesse didn't die with his boots on. That this young man became this very old man. But if the evidence of souvenir hunters is anything to go by, well, the Missouri Jesse wins hands down. This is all that remains of the original stone pillar that used to stand guard over his grave. It was chipped away by visitors, and the new grave marker is starting to go the same way. Will Jesse never rest in peace?
The reason we exhumed in 1995 was put everything to rest, but it didn't work. Everybody wants to be related to Jesse James, or claim that they were Jesse James, and the legend just lives on.
Reputations rise and fall. a gunslinger becomes a national icon, while a nation's leader is treated as a common criminal displayed on a spike. The lesson here must be kill a king, and history will never forget or forgive such a crime.
For the people to try and kill their own king was sacrilegiously scandalous and unbelievable.
In one of the most amazing episodes in English history, the man who killed this king was brought to judgment after he was already dead. Civil war raged in 17th century England. Brother killed brother. Fathers fought against sons. They battled to decide whether England should remain a monarchy ruled by King Charles I, or become a republic, with Parliament the supreme authority. Cavaliers fought for the king, the Roundheads for Parliament. The fortunes of war swayed back and forth until finally the Roundhead soldiers swept to victory. King Charles I was toppled from his throne. The victorious Roundhead leader was a battle-hardened general, a tough guy, Oliver Cromwell. The king, though imprisoned, would always be a rallying point for the Cavaliers. The order was issued: kill the king. He was beheaded on January 30th, 1649.
This sent shockwaves throughout Europe. This just was not done. For the people to rise up for any pretense whatsoever and kill their own king was almost unheard of. But the English did it. Charles I had been noted as being a pretty short guy all along. He was even shorter after that.
There was a vacancy for the job of ruler. Oliver Cromwell filled it.
Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector of England, the uncrowned King of England, and at one point, probably the most powerful man in Europe.
When he died, he was buried in the traditional resting place of English kings, London's Westminster Abbey.
But the politics took a sudden turn, and within 2 years, the restoration occurred, and the royal family, voila, was back in power, and they were out for revenge. Charles II was pretty darn mad about his father's head being cut off, and he was determined to get revenge on all the culprits so that he could lay hands on, even the dead ones, like Oliver Cromwell. The fact that he was dead didn't deter Charles II at all. He went right after him, and he actually arranged for the body to be exhumed. It was dragged through the streets like a common criminal, then beheaded. They buried the body beneath the gallows. The head, however, was stuck on a pike, and within a few days it appeared upon one of the top parapets of Westminster Hall.
Cromwell's head had to wait 300 years for a decent burial. 3 centuries in which it variously became a sideshow attraction and museum exhibit, before in 1960 it was gifted to the place where Cromwell had once studied, Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge.
They decided to give it honorable burial in secret so that nobody could steal it again, because various people are still mad at Cromwell. The Irish, for instance, they just don't think anything of him at all, and they might want to steal it, or another souvenir hunter or something. So they secretly buried it near the chapel entrance of Sidney Sussex College, and it's still there, we think.
They say time heals. Have the English people at last forgiven the man who killed their king? Seems like they have. Who's this? standing proudly outside Britain's Parliament today. It isn't King Charles I, but yes, Oliver Cromwell, head and all. Though they were feared in their day, some of the evil dead are fondly remembered. Take this sinister lady. A killer, we believe. A fire raiser, too. But a living legend down in the deep south. Today, Yazoo, Mississippi is a city of 3,000 souls. In Glenwood Cemetery, on the edge of town, you'll find thousands more of Yazoo's dear departed. But you'll also find someone who's not so dear to Yazoo folk, in the weirdest grave you're ever likely to see. She came from out of the woods, and here in Yazoo City, she's never been forgotten.
The old woman looked half scarecrow, half ghost, but all witch.
It's said that around 1870, Yazoo folks began to disappear in mysterious circumstances. So one day, a fisherman, Joe Bob Duggett, decided to check out the witch's cottage on the edge of the swamp. He found her with a fresh corpse on the kitchen table. He ran back to the city to raise a posse. A crowd returned with hoes and pitchforks to confront the witch. She took off towards the swamp.
She ran into the swamps. Before she went under, she had time to shout, "I will break through my grave and I will burn down the town of Yazoo."
They buried the witch in Glenwood Cemetery, taking the precaution of surrounding the grave with huge chain links in case she tried to break out. That should hold her, they thought. But the witch was as good as her word. On May 25th, 1904, Yazoo City burned down.
For the smoke had cleared. Someone remembered the curse of the old witch, and they came here to the cemetery. There they found the chain was broken. Do you believe?
In Yazoo, they certainly do. Even today, the chains are regularly inspected to make sure that the witch stays put. Shakespeare wrote that evil deeds are remembered far longer than any good we do. Sure, though in time we forget the crime. We look back at the bad guys with fascination, sometimes even affection. That's because we just love to weave legends. What works for heroes works for villains too. When you're larger than life, you'll always be larger than death.